The German officer's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the after-action report in the dim light of his bunker somewhere along the Western Front. His words were measured but carried an undercurrent of something rarely seen in Wehrmacht documentation. Genuine apprehension. These were not the observations of a propaganda minister seeking to inflate enemy capabilities for political purposes, but the clinical assessments of battle-hardened veterans who had faced the armies of multiple nations and learned to distinguish between mere resolve and something far more dangerous. The reports filtering up through German command described an enemy force that fought with a calculated brutality that made even seasoned soldiers uneasy. Troops who seemed to view the battlefield not as a place of survival but as an arena for proving something to the world and to themselves. When the Great War ended in 1918, the major powers emerged, transformed by the industrial slaughter of trench warfare. America had proven its capacity to mobilize massive industrial resources and field enormous armies, its strength lying in the sheer weight of men and materiel it could bring to bear. Britain had demonstrated the grim tenacity of an empire fighting for survival. Its forces hardened by years of attrition, yet increasingly exhausted by the endless demands of global conflict. But among the Allied nations, one force had carved out a reputation that transcended mere numbers or industrial capacity. A reputation built on aggressive tactics, intensive training, and a collective determination to prove their worth on the world stage. Canada entered both world wars not as a conscripted mass but largely as a volunteer force, men who chose to cross an ocean to fight in conflicts that many saw as European problems. This volunteer spirit created a unique dynamic within the ranks. Soldiers who felt they had something to prove not just to the enemy but to the world that had long viewed their nation as merely a British dominion of farmers and frontiersmen. The Canadian Corps of the First World War had earned grudging respect from German commanders, but respect born of fear is a different currency altogether. By the time the Second World War erupted, that reputation had crystallized into something that German intelligence officers tracked with particular attention, noting patterns of behavior that set these forces apart from their allies. The question that haunted German strategic planning was deceptively simple. Why did soldiers who faced American, British, and Canadian forces consistently report the greatest apprehension about encountering the latter? The Americans brought overwhelming firepower and seemed to believe any problem could be solved by throwing enough resources at it until the enemy was simply buried under the weight of steel and explosives. The British fought with the methodical discipline of a professional army, executing orders with precision, even when exhausted and depleted by years of continuous warfare. But the Canadians fought differently, with an aggressive initiative and a willingness to close with the enemy that made defensive positions feel suddenly vulnerable and turned quiet sectors into bloodbaths with little warning. Understanding this phenomenon requires examining not just battlefield performance but the cultural and psychological factors that shaped how these forces approached warfare. The Canadian military establishment had learned crucial lessons from the previous war, lessons about the value of thorough training, the importance of unit cohesion, and the devastating effectiveness of troops who were trained not just to follow orders, but to think and adapt on the battlefield. They had spent years in Britain before major deployments, honing their skills and developing a doctrine that emphasized shock tactics and aggressive patrolling, creating formations that German intelligence would come to designate with particular notation in their briefings, warnings that translated roughly to exercise extreme caution when facing these units. The transformation of civilian volunteers into what German reports would later call shock troops began long before the first combat deployments in the Second World War. While other nations rushed partially trained units into combat to meet urgent manpower needs, Canadian forces underwent extended training periods that built not just individual skills but unit cohesion and tactical flexibility. The training grounds in England became laboratories for developing an approach to infantry combat that prioritized aggression and initiative over the more cautious defensive doctrines that dominated much of Allied military thinking. Officers emphasized that hesitation killed more men than bold action, that the enemy respected violence of action more than careful planning, and that the best defense was often a vicious counterattack that left the enemy reeling. This training philosophy produced soldiers who approached combat differently than their counterparts in other armies. While American units often relied on calling in massive artillery and air support before advancing, and British forces executed methodical set-piece attacks, Canadian units developed a reputation for aggressive patrolling and lightning raids that kept enemy forces off balance and unable to predict where the next blow would fall. Night raids became a specialty. Small units infiltrating enemy lines to gather intelligence, capture prisoners, and create chaos in rear areas. These operations were not just tactically valuable, but psychologically devastating to enemy morale, creating an atmosphere where German soldiers in certain sectors learned to dread the darkness and the sudden violence that might erupt from it without warning. The doctrine extended beyond tactics to encompass a broader philosophy about the nature of warfare. Canadian military thinking emphasized that modern combat rewarded boldness and punished caution, that the side willing to accept casualties in pursuit of decisive action would ultimately prevail over forces that sought to minimize losses through defensive postures. This was not reckless disregard for soldier welfare, but a calculated assessment that aggressive tactics, properly executed, actually reduced overall casualties by keeping the enemy off balance and preventing them from organizing effective defenses. Officers studied the lessons of the previous war, particularly the successes of units that had broken the stalemate through shock tactics and coordinated combined arms operations, rather than futile frontal assaults against prepared positions. The human element proved equally important in forging this military effectiveness. Many volunteers came from rural backgrounds, men accustomed to harsh conditions and physical labor who adapted readily to the demands of military life. Others were urban workers, motivated by economic necessity or genuine belief in the cause, seeking purpose, and identity in military service. What united them was a collective chip on their shoulder, a sense that their nation had been overlooked and underestimated on the world stage, and a determination to prove that Canadian soldiers were second to none. This psychological dynamic created a competitive intensity within the ranks, units vying with each other for the toughest assignments and most dangerous missions, building a culture where backing down or showing weakness was unthinkable. By the time Canadian forces began deploying to combat theaters, they represented something unusual in modern warfare: a volunteer force with extended training, aggressive doctrine, and a collective psychological drive to prove their worth through battlefield performance. German intelligence noted these factors with growing concern as reports accumulated from units that had faced them in combat. The assessments described not just tactical competence but something more unsettling: an enemy that seemed to relish close combat and showed little inclination toward taking prisoners when alternative options existed. These were not the weekend soldiers that early German assessments had dismissed, but a force that would reshape enemy planning and force allocation throughout multiple campaigns across the European theater. The baptism of fire for Canadian forces in the Second World War came not in the dramatic beach landings that would define later operations, but in smaller, grinding engagements that tested doctrine against reality. The Dieppe raid of 1,942 proved catastrophic in terms of casualties, with nearly two-thirds of the attacking force killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. German defenders inflicted devastating losses on troops, attempting to cross exposed beaches under withering fire, a brutal demonstration that courage and aggression could not overcome fundamental tactical disadvantages. Yet even in this disaster, German after-action reports noted the ferocity with which attacking forces had pressed forward despite hopeless circumstances, fighting until killed or physically unable to continue, establishing a pattern that would recur throughout the war. The lessons of Dieppe were absorbed and applied to subsequent operations with ruthless efficiency. Canadian planners recognized that frontal assaults against prepared positions required overwhelming fire support and tactical flexibility, but they did not abandon the core emphasis on aggressive action. Instead, they refined their approach, combining the shock tactics that had proven effective in raiding operations with better coordination of armor, artillery, and air support. The result was a force that retained its aggressive edge while adding the combined arms sophistication necessary for success against prepared German defenses. Training intensified, with particular emphasis on urban combat techniques and coordination between infantry and armor that would prove crucial in later battles. When Canadian forces landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, they brought this refined doctrine to bear against one of the most heavily defended coastlines in history. The initial assault waves faced the same deadly obstacles that challenged all Allied forces that morning: concrete fortifications, interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft and impale infantry. What distinguished the Canadian assault was the speed with which they pushed inland once the beach defenses were breached, refusing to consolidate gains and instead pressing forward to seize objectives deeper in enemy territory. By the end of the first day, Canadian forces had penetrated further inland than any other Allied formation, a feat that German defenders had thought impossible based on their defensive planning. The advance from the beaches transformed into a grinding campaign through Norman hedgerow country, where every field became a potential killing ground, and German defenders used the terrain to maximum advantage. Here, the Canadian emphasis on aggressive patrolling and night operations proved decisive, small units infiltrating enemy positions to identify weaknesses and guide larger attacks. The fighting developed a particular brutality as both sides recognized that quarter was rarely asked or given. Wounded often finished where they lay, and prisoners taken only when operationally necessary. German reports from this period describe Canadian units with a mixture of professional respect and genuine apprehension, noting their tendency to bypass strong points rather than waste time reducing them, leaving isolated German positions surrounded and waiting for follow-on forces to eliminate them. The capture of Caen became a focal point of Allied operations, the city's position making it crucial for breakout operations but defended by some of Germany's best formations. Canadian forces found themselves repeatedly committed to brutal urban combat, where the aggressive tactics that worked well in open terrain became costly and attritional. Buildings were cleared room by room, streets fought over with grenades and submachine guns at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of yards. Yet even here, the doctrine of aggressive action paid dividends, as German defenders found themselves constantly pressed and unable to organize effective counterattacks. The city fell in stages, each gain measured in city blocks and paid for with casualties that would have broken less determined formations, but each gain also brought Allied forces closer to the breakout that would shatter German defenses in Normandy. The breakout from Normandy unleashed a different kind of warfare, one that played to Canadian strengths in mobile operations and aggressive pursuit. As German defenses collapsed under the weight of coordinated Allied attacks, Canadian armored formations exploited gaps with a speed that left enemy commanders struggling to establish coherent defensive lines. The pursuit phase of operations saw Canadian forces racing across France, bypassing German strongpoints, and driving deep into enemy rear areas to cut lines of communication and supply. German units attempting to establish defensive positions found themselves outflanked before they could properly dig in, forced into headlong retreats that sacrificed equipment and cohesion in the desperate attempt to avoid encirclement and destruction. The Channel ports became the next major objective, fortified positions that German high command had designated as fortresses to be held at all costs. These ports were crucial for Allied logistics, and their capture became a priority that fell largely to Canadian forces pushing up the coast. The fighting for these ports demonstrated both the strengths and costs of aggressive doctrine, as attacking forces faced prepared defenses with limited room for maneuver. Each port required systematic reduction of fortified positions, fighting that combined the brutality of urban combat with the technical challenges of assaulting concrete bunkers and underground positions. German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew no retreat was possible. Yet even these advantages could not offset the relentless pressure applied by attacking forces that refused to settle into static siege warfare. The Scheldt Estuary campaign stands as perhaps the most demanding operation Canadian forces undertook during the war, a battle fought in conditions that seemed designed to negate every advantage modern armies possessed. The approaches to Antwerp wound through flooded lowlands where solid ground existed only on narrow causeways and dikes, terrain that channeled attacking forces into killing zones and made maneuver nearly impossible. German defenders had flooded large areas deliberately, creating a landscape of freezing water, sucking mud, and isolated strong points that could only be approached across open ground under observed fire. The weather turned foul, cold rain and occasional snow adding misery to danger, reducing visibility and making every movement an exhausting struggle against the elements as much as the enemy. Operations in the Scheldt required adapting tactics to terrain that violated every principle of armored warfare and made even infantry operations nightmarish. Attacks were launched across open ground where concealment was impossible, soldiers wading through waist-deep water while machine guns traversed pre-registered firing lanes. Casualties mounted with each assault, yet the attacks continued with a relentlessness that gradually wore down even the most determined German resistance. Small gains were consolidated and used as bases for further advances. Each position captured opening new angles of attack against remaining strongpoints. The fighting developed a methodical quality, less dramatic than breakthroughs in open terrain, but no less intense. Combat reduced to its most basic elements of courage, endurance, and willingness to continue advancing despite appalling conditions and certain casualties. The capture of Walcheren Island represented the culmination of the campaign, an amphibious assault against prepared defenses that required applying lessons learned at terrible cost earlier in the war. Canadian and British forces coordinated naval gunfire, airstrikes, and ground assault in an operation that breached German defenses through sheer overwhelming force applied at decisive points. The island fell after days of intense fighting, opening the Scheldt to Allied shipping and solving the logistics crisis that had threatened to stall Allied advances into Germany. German prisoners taken during the final stages of the battle expressed relief at capture, describing weeks of constant bombardment and attack that had ground down their units and left survivors exhausted and demoralized. The victory came at a terrible price, thousands of casualties for terrain that offered no strategic value beyond opening a waterway. Yet, Allied planners considered it essential, and the forces that captured it had proven once again their willingness to pay the necessary cost. The Italian campaign presented different challenges entirely. Urban combat in historic cities where every building became a fortress, and modern armies destroyed architecture that had stood for centuries. Canadian forces deployed to Italy found themselves committed to some of the most grinding combat of the war, fighting through mountain valleys and medieval towns where defenders held every advantage terrain could offer. The battle for Ortona in December 1943 became emblematic of this new style of warfare, a week-long struggle for a small Adriatic port that German command had designated a key defensive position. The Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, defending the city, were among Germany's elite formations, veterans of multiple campaigns who understood urban combat and were determined to exact maximum cost for every percent of the times of this rilling block captured. The fighting in Ortona introduced Canadian forces to techniques they would refine and employ throughout subsequent urban battles. Traditional street fighting proved suicidal against prepared defenses, so attacking forces developed the tactic of mouse-holing, blowing through interior walls to advance from building to building without exposing themselves to fire from adjacent structures. Combat engineers became crucial, using explosives to breach walls, while infantry provided covering fire and cleared rooms with grenades and close-range weapons. The sounds of battle became a constant roar of explosions and automatic weapons fire echoing through narrow streets, punctuated by the crash of buildings collapsing under artillery fire or demolitions. Dust and smoke reduced visibility to a few meters, combat occurring at ranges where soldiers could see their enemies' faces before killing them. German defenders fought with professional skill and determination, turning every building into a strong point and booby-trapping structures before withdrawing to the next defensive line. They employed snipers to dominate key intersections, positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, and used the rubble created by Allied bombardment to construct additional defensive positions. Yet even these advantages could not stop the methodical Canadian advance, as attacking forces adapted tactics in real time and maintained pressure that prevented defenders from resting or reorganizing. The battle developed a rhythm, with daylight hours devoted to grinding advances measured in tens of meters, and nights spent consolidating gains and preparing for the next day's attacks. Neither side asked quarter, and prisoners were rare, combat too close and personal to allow for the formalities that sometimes prevailed in more open warfare. The climax came in bitter house-to-house fighting around the town square, where German paratroopers made their final stand before the Tour, withdrawing under cover of darkness. Canadian forces emerged victorious but exhausted, having taken a small town at the cost of casualties that shocked even commanders accustomed to the butcher's bill of modern warfare. Yet, the victory demonstrated something crucial about the effectiveness of well-trained aggressive infantry against elite German formations, in conditions that theoretically favored the defender. The techniques developed at Ortona would be applied in subsequent urban battles across Europe, influencing Allied doctrine, and proving that cities could be taken through systematic application of combined arms tactics and infantry, willing to engage in the brutal close-quarters combat that urban terrain demanded. The psychological impact of Ortona extended beyond tactical lessons to reinforce the reputation Canadian forces had been building throughout multiple campaigns. German intelligence reports circulated assessments of the battle that emphasized the relentlessness of attacking forces and their apparent indifference to casualties when committed to an objective. These reports contributed to a growing body of evidence that German commanders used when making decisions about force allocation and defensive priorities, assessments that recognized Canadian formations as particularly dangerous opponents who warranted extra attention in planning and resource allocation. The legend of the weekend soldiers had been thoroughly demolished, replaced by a reputation that made German soldiers uneasy when they learned which Allied forces they would face in upcoming operations. The final campaigns of the European War saw Canadian forces committed to the liberation of the Netherlands and the drive into Germany itself, operations that combined mobile warfare with urban combat and river crossings against increasingly desperate German resistance. By early 1945, German forces were fighting on multiple fronts, with dwindling resources and manpower, yet they continued to resist with a determination born of ideology and fear of consequences should they surrender. Canadian forces advancing through the Netherlands encountered German units that fought with the knowledge that retreat meant only further combat on German soil, and that surrender might lead to prosecution for the regime's crimes. This combination of factors created battles where quarter was rarely given, and combat took on an even more brutal character than earlier campaigns. The liberation of Dutch cities became particularly complex operations, as German forces used civilian populations as shields, and Canadian forces sought to minimize collateral damage to infrastructure and civilians who had suffered years of occupation. Yet, the imperative to advance could not be subordinated entirely to humanitarian concerns, and battles were fought in city streets where civilians huddled in basements while combat raged overhead. The Dutch population welcomed liberators with genuine joy, emerging from occupation to find themselves in the middle of active combat zones, offering what assistance they could to forces fighting to drive out occupiers. The contrast between grateful civilians and determined German resistance created surreal scenes, battles pausing briefly to evacuate civilians before resuming with renewed intensity. The Rhine crossings represented major military operations, river barriers that German command hoped would delay Allied advances long enough to negotiate some kind of settlement short of unconditional surrender. Canadian forces participated in multiple river assault operations, amphibious attacks under fire that required precise coordination and nerves of steel from troops crossing invulnerable landing craft. German defenders knew every crossing site was a choke point where Allied forces were most vulnerable, and they prepared defenses designed to turn river crossings into killing grounds. Yet the crossings succeeded through the application of overwhelming firepower and the courage of assault troops who pressed forward despite devastating casualties in the initial waves, establishing bridgeheads that follow-on forces exploited to break through German defenses on the far bank. The final weeks of the war saw German resistance collapsing in some sectors while remaining fanatical in others, creating a patchwork battlefield where some units surrendered readily while others fought to the death. Canadian forces advancing into Germany encountered the full horror of the Nazi regime, liberation of concentration camps, providing stark evidence of the evil they had been fighting. The discovery of these camps hardened attitudes toward German prisoners and resistance, any lingering notions of professional military respect evaporating in the face of industrial-scale atrocities. Combat in Germany took on a harder edge, German civilians fleeing before advancing forces while remaining German military units fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat was inevitable but sought to delay it as long as possible. The capture of entire German divisions in the war's final days represented not just tactical success, but the culmination of years of military evolution and battlefield experience. When German forces surrendered en masse, Canadian units found themselves processing thousands of prisoners, men who had fought for a regime that was collapsing around them. The irony was not lost on observers. These weekend soldiers dismissed early in the war by German intelligence had proven instrumental in defeating what had been considered the world's finest military machine. The transformation from dismissed colonial forces to formations that German commanders genuinely feared represented a remarkable journey, one paid for in blood and suffering but validated by decisive contributions to Allied victory across multiple theaters and campaigns throughout the longest and most destructive conflict in human history. The accounting of costs reveals the true price of forging a military reputation through aggressive combat doctrine and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of victory. Canadian forces suffered over 100,000 casualties during the Second World War from a population of only 11 million, a casualty rate that represented staggering losses for a nation with no direct threat to its homeland. Nearly every family felt the war's impact through the loss or wounding of sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands who had volunteered to fight in what began as a distant European conflict. The reputation for ferocity and effectiveness came at a moral cost as well. Questions about conduct in combat that complicated simple narratives of heroism and sacrifice. The reports of limited prisoner-taking, the reputation for brutal reprisals, and the aggressive tactics that sometimes crossed lines between military necessity and revenge created uncomfortable realities. Canadian military historians have grappled with these complexities, acknowledging that the same aggression that made Canadian forces so effective also led to incidents that violated standards of conduct. The strategic value of Canadian contributions is difficult to quantify precisely but clearly significant when examined across multiple campaigns. The capture of Channel ports accelerated Allied logistics and shortened the war's timeline. The clearing of the Scheldt opened Antwerp to shipping at a crucial moment. The liberation of the Netherlands removed German forces from defensive positions they had prepared for months. Each contribution represented not just tactical success but strategic impact that shaped the war's course. The German perspective on Canadian forces evolved dramatically, from early dismissive assessments to genuine respect and apprehension. Intelligence reports consistently rated Canadian formations as particularly dangerous opponents, noting their aggressive tactics and high training standards. These assessments influenced German planning and resource allocation, with elite formations sometimes held in reserve specifically to counter expected Canadian attacks. The transformation from weekend soldiers to feared shock troops represents a case study in military effectiveness that transcends simple narratives about national character. The combination of volunteer motivation, extended training, aggressive doctrine, and combat experience created a force that genuinely distinguished itself. Yet, this effectiveness came at profound costs, paid not just in casualty lists but in psychological trauma, moral compromises, and a legacy that subsequent generations have struggled to understand. The legacy of Canadian military performance in World War II shaped national identity in ways that extended far beyond military history. A nation that had entered the conflict as a British dominion emerged with a stronger sense of independent identity, having proven its military capabilities on the world stage. The war became a defining national narrative, stories of sacrifice and effectiveness that Canadians told themselves about who they were as a people. The military lessons learned influenced post-war doctrine not just in Canada but across NATO alliance structures that emerged from the Cold War. The emphasis on aggressive small unit tactics, the integration of combined arms at tactical levels, and the value of extended training before combat deployment became principles that shaped Western military thinking for decades. Canadian military institutions preserved institutional knowledge through training programs and professional military education. The psychological dimension of Canadian military effectiveness raises uncomfortable questions about what creates successful combat soldiers and what that success costs. The aggression that German reports emphasized was not an innate national characteristic, but cultivated through training, experience, and the psychological dynamics of volunteer forces, seeking to prove themselves. Understanding how ordinary men became capable of extraordinary violence requires confronting realities about human nature that challenge comfortable assumptions. The comparative analysis with other Allied forces reveals that military effectiveness derives from complex interactions rather than simple national stereotypes. American forces brought industrial might, British forces contributed professional competence, Soviet forces offered mass and determination. Canadian effectiveness represented a specific combination of factors that aligned well with the demands of warfare in the 1,940 seconds, creating formations that excelled at particular types of operations. The moral reckoning with how wars are fought and won remains incomplete as societies struggle to honor sacrifice while acknowledging costs. The Canadian military experience encompasses both genuine heroism and troubling episodes, strategic contributions and moral failures. Wrestling with this complexity is essential for understanding not just Canadian history but the nature of modern warfare itself, how industrial societies mobilize populations for violence, and what transformations that mobilization requires. The individual stories that comprise the collective narrative reveal human dimensions often lost in strategic analyses and casualty statistics. Letters home spoke of boredom punctuated by terror, of friendships formed with men who would die days later, of landscapes destroyed by industrial warfare. Veterans who survived returned home carrying memories they rarely shared completely, experiences too intense or too dark to translate into civilian contexts, where people had no frame of reference for what combat truly entailed. The reintegration of veterans into peacetime society proved challenging for many who had spent formative years in military service. Men who had commanded platoons and made life-or-death decisions found themselves working ordinary jobs where the stakes seemed trivial. Those who had experienced the intensity of combat sometimes struggled with civilian life that felt meaningless by comparison. Support systems for dealing with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress were primitive, leaving many veterans to cope alone with nightmares and memories. The German soldiers who faced Canadian forces carried their own stories and perspectives. Men who had fought for a regime whose full evil many claimed not to have understood until after defeat. Their accounts of facing Canadian attacks emphasized the relentlessness and aggression that made these encounters particularly harrowing. Some German veterans expressed professional respect for opponents who had fought effectively, while others carried bitterness about tactics they considered beyond the bounds of acceptable warfare. The civilian populations caught between opposing armies paid terrible prices for military operations conducted across their lands. Dutch civilians starved during Prussia, the final winter of occupation, while battles raged for their liberation. Italian families saw historic cities reduced to rubble in fighting they had no power to prevent. French villagers rebuilt communities destroyed in the advance across their country. These populations welcomed liberation even as they mourned the destruction that liberation required. The question of whether the aggressive doctrine that made Canadian forces so effective was worth the costs remains debatable and perhaps unanswerable. Military historians can point to successful operations and strategic contributions, but weighing these against the human costs of casualties, trauma, and moral compromises involves value judgments that transcend purely military analysis. The effectiveness was real, the contributions significant, and the costs staggering, leaving subsequent generations to grapple with what this legacy means. The transformation from weekend soldiers to shock troops that German commanders genuinely feared stands as testament to what organized societies can achieve when they commit resources and will to military effectiveness. The journey from dismissed colonials to formations that warranted special notation in enemy intelligence reports represented a remarkable evolution, accomplished through choices about training, doctrine, and operational employment that created forces exceptionally suited to the demands they faced. The human cost of this transformation cannot be separated from its military success. Every tactical victory and strategic contribution was purchased with casualties that devastated families and communities across Canada. The psychological toll on survivors created a generation of veterans who carried invisible wounds alongside visible ones. Men transformed by experiences that civilian society struggled to understand or adequately address. The moral complexities of how these forces fought added layers of difficulty to processing what had been achieved and at what cost. The German assessment that evolved from dismissive contempt to genuine apprehension provides perhaps the most objective measure of Canadian military effectiveness. Enemy commanders who had faced multiple Allied armies and learned to distinguish between propaganda and reality concluded that Canadian forces warranted particular caution and special defensive measures. This assessment was not based on nationalist bias, but on accumulated battlefield experience and the professional judgments of officers whose survival depended on accurate threat assessment. The legacy extends beyond military history to questions about national identity, the nature of warfare, and how societies remember and honor sacrifice. Canada emerged from World War II as a nation that had proven itself on the world stage, but the proving came at costs that complicated simple narratives of glory and heroism. The soldiers who earned that fearsome reputation were neither superhuman warriors nor bloodthirsty killers, but ordinary men transformed by training, experience, and the demands of industrial warfare into effective instruments of violence. The final accounting must acknowledge both the genuine military effectiveness achieved and the profound costs paid to achieve it. The weekend soldiers became shock troops through processes that honored their courage while sometimes compromising their humanity. They contributed decisively to Allied victory in a just war against genuine evil. Yet the methods required to achieve that victory included moral compromises that subsequent generations must acknowledge. Their story stands as both inspiration and warning, testament to human capability for both remarkable achievement and terrible violence when societies mobilize for total war.